In this video, you're going to start filling the elements that you created so far using Flexbox. So you're going to start with the details section. So inside this section, as mentioned before, you're going to build a few Flexboxes for these combinations of labels and inputs. So to make things clear, I'm going to create a div of class address, and then inside this div, I'm going to have 3 Flexboxes. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So inside the details div, I'm going to have one div of class address, and then inside this div, I'm going to have 3 divs. So each div, I'm going to give it a class of form group, for example, where I'm going to place a label and input. And then each of these divs is going to be a flexbox where we're going to distribute the width between the label and the input. So if you look at the final code, these are the labels I'm talking about. So I'm going to copy that label and that input inside this first flexbox. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the other labels and inputs. So I'm going to pause the video and do that to save time. Here we go. Now we've got all the combinations of labels and inputs inside the form group divs, which we're going to convert to flexboxes. So let's go ahead and do this. So to make our CSS sheet well structured, I'm going to add a few titles. So inside the form, the first element is the container. And then inside the container, we're going to have our first sub-element, which is the details. And then inside the details, we're going to have other elements. And the comments are going to be the second sub-elements of the container, like this. And inside the details, we're going to have our first sub-elements of details, which is the address. So you're going to put the styling inside the address right there. So the first class I'm going to select here is the form group, which I'm going to turn to a flexbox by setting the display to flex. All right. And to make things even easier to read, you can actually select the form group class inside the address class if you like, since the form group div is inside the address div. So here's how our layout looks like at the moment. So that's a flexbox, and those two are flexboxes too. Okay. Now let's distribute the width between the label and the input. So let's select the label first. So you're going to go to the address div and then the form group div, and inside it we're going to select the label, and let's set the flex to 1 and the flex of the input to 3. So that's one takes 1/4 and that one takes 3/4 of the width. Also, we're going to push the text to the right inside this flex item by setting its text align property to right. Now let's add some space between the form groups by giving the form group class a margin. So before setting the margin, I'm going to set a font size for the form so that we can set margins and font sizes relative to this value. using the M units. So first of all, let's set the font size to something like 24 pixels. And then later on, whenever I use 1M, it's going to refer to 24 pixels. Okay. So if I set the margin to 1M, that means that we're setting the margin to 24 pixels. Now let's look at the final layout and just see if that's all right. That looks fine. Now let's set the font size of the inputs to 1EM as well. All right. And let's add some space between the labels and the inputs by giving the labels a margin right. And let's set that to 1M. Okay, that looks fine. I'll come back later to the border radius of the inputs as well as the background color. So for now, we are done with the address div, and now we are ready to move to the next one, which is the shipping div. So we're going to create a div for this section, and you can see that we've got a couple of elements. We've got some text there, and then we've got a select input. So right after the address div, let's create a div of class shipping, for example, and place these elements inside it. So let's put them inside divs. So inside the first div, I'm going to place this text, and then inside the second div, I'm going to copy the select inputs from there. All done. So let's see how it looks like. So we've got our elements there. So let's try to do this without using a flexbox and see how it goes. So let's go to the shipping class. So let's add another title just like that one. So it's going to be shipping. So for now, we just need to center these elements, which we can do easily by selecting the shipping class and setting text align to center. So that works. Now this div inherits the font size from the form's font size, but the select item or element doesn't do that. So we're going to need to select it specifically. So you're going to go to the shipping class and then to the select element, and then we're going to set the font size to 1M. All right. And let's also add some margin top to separate it from this text. And let's go for 1M. Let's go for 0.5M. That's probably better. Perfect. All right. Now let's move to the next bit, which is going to be the payments section. So this section has got a couple of elements. So the first one is a div, which is centered right there. And then we've got these radio buttons with their labels. And you can see that the width of this div is distributed equally between all these inputs. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a flexbox and distribute the width using the flex property. So let's go ahead and do this. So let's create a new div right after the shipping div and give it a class payment. And inside this div, let's have a div for the text and another one where I'm going to copy the different radio buttons with their labels. Perfect. So let's go to this div first and center the text inside it. So you're going to have a new section. Payment. And we're going to select the payment class and center the text using the text align property. Right, so now our text is centered. Now we're going to need to select this div and make it a flexbox. Now we don't have any class for this div, but we have a class for the parent div. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select this div by going to the parent payment and then selecting the div which is the second child of its parent. So to do this, I'm going to go to the payment class, which is the parent, and then I'm going to select the div, which is the second child of its parents. And to do that, I'm going to use the nth child and choose the second one by passing the parameter 2 to nth child. Okay. So now if you do anything, for example, background color, then you know that you are selecting this div. Okay, so what we want to do, we want to make this div a flexbox. So I'm going to set its display property to flex. And then I'm going to go to the labels inside this div. And you can see that the labels here wrap the input. So we just need to select the label. So I'm going to go to this div, then go to the labels, and then I'm going to give them a flex property of 1 so that they all take the same width. Okay, so that's how it works. Now let's add a little bit of margin on top of the radio buttons. So let's set the margin top property to 0.5 m. And also let's add some margin right there by setting margin top to 1 m, for example. Perfect. Now let's move to the next bit. So we've got these two checkboxes with their labels, and you can tell that we're using again a flexbox here, and each one of them is actually using half the width of that row. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new div following the payment div, and let's give it a class of checks, for example. So inside this div, I'm simply going to copy paste the two labels which wrap the checkboxes. So since we want to make this a flexbox, I'm going to go to the checks class. So first, let's create a new section. And then select the checks class and make it a flexbox by setting the display property to flex. Now let's select these two elements by going inside checks, then label, and setting the flex property to 1 so that they both take the same width. Now if you look at the final website, this element comes first, while at the moment in our website it comes second. So we want to reorder these two elements. So how can we do this? Well, you can either go back to the index.html file and do that manually, just take this label and put it on top of the other, or you can use the order attribute, which you're going to set to 1 for the second item and then 2 for the first item to reverse their order. Well, let's go ahead and try that. So let's select the first item. So you're going to select the item which is the first child of its parent. And we're going to give it an order property of 2. And then we're going to select the second element and give it an order of 1. And this is the order that we wanted. But you could notice that without doing that, you still get the right order by giving a big order to one of the elements. So if you give a big order greater than 1 to one of the elements, then you make sure that that element comes second or comes last in your layout. Otherwise, you can just select the other elements that you want to appear first and give it a negative order, and this will work just fine. All right.